In the wake of the Second World War and the Holocaust, survivors of the Nazi camps dealt as they could with their raw memories. Some spoke out about what had happened, while others refused to relive the horrors of the camps by reviving them through words. Still others were led to keep silent after hitting a wall of incomprehension or even a total refusal to hear on the part of their interlocutors. Simone Weil expresses thusly to French historian Annette Vieviorca in a personal interview, so I translate what Simone Weil said. "We often hear that the prisoners wanted to forget and chose to remain silent. If I take my own experience, I was always ready to talk, to testify about it, but no one wanted to hear us." In the post-war years, this refusal to hear the accounts of the survivors contributed to making their return from deportation and their reintegration to civilian life even more difficult. Amongst the survivors, women and Jewish people were particularly weighed down by this collective deafness linked to indifference towards minorities and to a war testimonial tradition that conditioned expectations regarding testimonies. In France, this testimonial tradition falls within the scope of Jean Norton Cru's masterly work, which gathered over 300 testimonies of World War I French soldiers. Women and representatives of religious minorities are not part of this tradition, and in the mindset of the post-war years, it remains still hardly conceivable that they would have something to say about the war. It is rather the resistance fighters and the partigiani who were granted the place of honor in matters of post-war patriotic enthusiasm. This did include a few women who, however, remain rather unnoticed in comparison to their male counterparts, a problem that endured for many decades, as French historian Rita Thalmann indicates in a 1995 article titled in French, "The Oversight of Women in the Resistance Historiography." So in this paper, I tend to turn my attention specifically to the testimonies published in French and Italian during the post-war years by people who, among the survivors, were particularly ignored, that is to say, women and Jewish survivors. It seems pertinent to me to examine the way these authors decided to break the silence through their testimonial accounts. A brief comparison between testimonies and letters that survivors Primo Levi and Jean Samuel wrote each other in the afterwar will enable us to get a better understanding of the way survivors recount their experiences according to who their reader is. The pragmatic notion of the modal reader presented by Umberto Eco will be useful as a reference frame to reflect on the role that the authors of testimonies give to imagination in the depiction of their experiences. Finally, I will look at the recurrence of intertextuality in those testimonies, which is a literary technique that serves as an experience transmission vehicle and as a reminder for the survivors of their belonging to the human species. The act of expressing themselves was critical for many survivors upon their return from the camps, psychologically to evacuate parts of their suffering, to structure through words experiences that could still seem incomprehensible to them, but also because the act of expressing oneself was forbidden in the camps. The very act of telling embodied a return to freedom. And yet survivors often relate how they were halted by the inadequacy of language to describe such experiences, but also by the veritable wall of incomprehension of their interlocutors. This led many to keep silent, preferring to speak of the camps only with other survivors. It is the case of Jean Samuel, an Alsatian, who was a member of a Jewish family, who was arrested by the Gestapo and deported to Auschwitz in 1944. He was part of the death marches and was liberated in Buchenwald on April 11, 1945. known today under the name of the character Jean Piccolo in the famous chapter Il canto di Ulisse of Primo Levi's Sequestro and Uomo. Jean Samuel kept silent about his camp experiences for 30 years, and he only spoke in person or by writing to other former prisoners. In the first letter that he addressed to Primo Levi, dated on the 13th of March 1946, Samuel writes, I translate, "And now forgive me to have inflicted such a long letter on you. I so needed to talk to a comrade in suffering." To Jean Samuel, for 3 decades, speaking of the camps will only have been possible with the assurance of exchanging with someone who had lived a similar experience. A comparison between testimonies and letters that certain survivors wrote each other is useful to perceive a difference in the way that they express themselves according to whom they wrote. Testimonies are addressed to a public that did not go through the camps, whereas the letters are addressed to a fellow camp survivor who really grasps what the speaker lived and felt. To better understand this difference, I propose comparing 2 passages evoking the arrival at the camp. One is described in a lapidary way in the correspondence between Jean Samuel and Primo Levi, whereas the other is narrated by French resistance fighter Denise Dufournier. So in a letter to Primo Levi, written on the 7th of February 1947, Jean Samuel mentions, I translate, "I will tell you of a few personal events. One, arrival at Auschwitz on March 30th, 1944. In the afternoon, we are led to Buna. Exhaustion from the trip, hunger, curiosity. Put yourself back in that scene." This passage shows that Samuel doesn't need to explain certain facts in detail to Levi because he knows that he will implicitly understand. It is not necessary in his letter to evoke the atmosphere of the arrival at the camp to another former prisoner. In Denise Dufournier's testimony that has been translated into English as Ravensbrück, the women's camp of death, however, the arrival at Ravensbrück is described in these terms. So I quote, "I fear that no account will ever express the shock that this arrival staging inflicted on us. An immense gate opened behind which an iron fence was lifted, resembling both a level crossing and a guillotine, gobbled us up row by row. To our stupefaction, we saw strange creatures clothed in striped dresses and jackets who were going around 2 by 2, carrying what seemed to be tanks of some kind. Had we suddenly become crazy? The outline of those shapeless, skinny bodies evoked the statues of the Middle Ages that decorate the gates of our cathedrals. I saw some of them pointing at us, grimacing in a diabolical laugh. I felt panic arising in me, a kind of terror, like the one felt by children hearing the stories of Nordic legends populated with fantastic beings that resemble at once gods, men, and beasts." End of quotation. Despite her qualms about the inadequacy of any account to describe her experience, Dufournier gives an imagery-filled description of her arrival in Ravensbrück, putting her entrance in the camp under the sign of death by establishing a resemblance between the gate and the sinister silhouette of the guillotine. And then she immediately personifies this gate as devouring the new prisoners. Dufournier carries on with her account by describing the older prisoners as strange creatures resembling gargoyles. To evoke her emotion, Dufournier uses a comparison, establishing a connection between her uncontrollable terror and the fear the fear felt by children when told stories of the Nordic legends, a comparison that I will come back to later. Addressing herself to a reader with no experience of the realities of the camp, Denise Dufournier uses all kinds of stylistic devices and narrative techniques to clarify her account. Techniques that Jean Samuel does not need to use when addressing himself to a former prisoner who has also lived through the camps. According to the survivors themselves, testimonies are often the product of a veritable urge to tell, which explains the writing process, but it doesn't explain the decision to publish. Primo Levi refers to this in a 1947 letter that he wrote to Jean Samuel. By the way, Primo Levi spoke French, and in his correspondence with Jean Samuel, he wrote to Samuel in French. So I quote him. My book is finally at the printing house. It will come out in September or October. I worked on it for a long time with love and rage. I don't know if it is mediocre, good, or very good, but I think I managed to do something more than to relieve myself from an obsession and save my memories from oblivion. Though only rarely reaching a large readership, the publication of Nazi camp testimonies aims to be a public voicing. As testimonies manifest a very strong will of transmission, it is important to examine how the authors take their reader into account. In order to do so, it is helpful to use the notion of the modal reader, which is in testimonies, as in any other type of text, the reader for whom the text is planned. Indeed, the modal reader is a construction of the author and does not necessarily correspond to an empirical reader, a possibility that was even less probable in the post-war context of the return of women and Jewish survivors from the camps. In Lector in Fabula, Umberto Eco, who recently passed away, explains that, I quote him, a text postulates its addressee as a sine qua non condition of its own concrete communicative capacity, but also of its own significant potentiality. In other words, a text is formulated for someone who is able to actualize it, even if it is not hoped that that someone exists concretely or empirically. End of quote. Wanting to make their testimonies as much of a transmissible experience as they could humanly and narratively be, it is possible that the authors of testimonies kept an imaginary reader in mind when they wrote. To quote Umberto Eco once again, anticipating its own modal reader doesn't only mean wishing that he or she exists, it also means acting upon the text in order to construct this reader. In the testimonies of the camps, passages indicating the intent of the authors and acknowledging the testimony's limits often involve, implicitly or explicitly, their expectations towards their model reader. In the foreword referring to the content of her testimony, Denise Dufournier very clearly states the impression that she intends to leave on her reader. So I translate. For my part, I can only, alas, arouse a rational emotion. The story of my exile in Ravensbrück could just as well be the story of any prisoner. I will add no conclusion to this book. I will endeavor to pass no judgment. I will only expose the facts. May they, however, awake in the reader a just anger. So in this passage that rhetorically shows humility, Dufournier seeks to emotionally touch her reader. More than pity or sadness, it is anger that she first and foremost wants him to feel. Jewish French survivor Guy Cohen, for his part, aims to provoke in his reader not emotions, but understanding. So I translate him. I have taken it upon myself from the beginning of this book not to show all the atrocities, tortures, etc. committed by the Nazis in these camps, but to give the reader, who is avid to document himself on those questions, an understanding of what daily life was in the Silesian concentration camps. Here, the avid to document himself reader is the model that Cohen presents to his empirical reader in order to direct his expectations. Indeed, in the afterwar, it was common for the interlocutor of a survivor to be especially curious to hear spectacular stories. As a former prisoner explains to Annie Laurent, so I quote this former prisoner who remained anonymous, I spoke out aloud to bear witness to what had happened, and people were listening. Some didn't dare ask questions, and others put forward idiotic questions, always, were you raped, and questions that were that stupid. By specifying that his reader wants to understand the daily life of the camps and not simply inform himself about the atrocities that were going on there, Cohen shifts the expectations of the postulated reader. In doing so, he programs his model reader. Understanding, however, will only be possible if the reader makes an effort of interpretation, a condition that the testimony's author cannot control. The survivor can nevertheless try to facilitate it through the construction of the account. In the post-war context where the civil population had trouble even imagining the nature of the concentration and extermination camp system, the survivor had to resort to the narrative device of imagination to give his or her reader a certain level of understanding. In his book Écrire les camps, so writing the camps, Alain Parot analyzes a passage from Robert Antelme's The Human Race, in which Antelme describes the convenience for the Allied soldiers to use to refer to Dachau the term unimaginable. So I quote Alain Parot. Unspeakable, unimaginable for Antelme set free the need for a courage of expression that passes through imagination. To imagine a language that says the unspeakable by representing it is to affirm that the truth of the camps denotes not imitation, but invention. End of quote. Parot's conclusion, as with Antelme, is that the reality of the camps is more easily conveyed through the medium of imagination than through factual narration of events. Imagination, therefore, plays a double role for the authors of testimonies. It first helps the survivors write their account by constructing a model reader, and it will then, potentially, help the reader better comprehend the experiences of the deportees. So, to construct the idea of a model reader capable of obtaining an understanding of the experiences of the camps, the authors of testimonies must work on their texts in such a way as to elicit from the reader the will to understand, as is implied by the quote from Guy Cohen referring to the expectations of his model reader, and in such a way as to facilitate this understanding. In many testimonies, comparisons feed the imagination of the reader, as we have seen previously in the passage from Denise Dufournier's testimony, where she evokes the childhood terrors to enable the reader to understand the fear that she felt upon her arrival in Ravensbrück. The use of intertextuality is another narrative technique that is especially efficient to activate the reader's imagination. So please allow me to give you one example among many others, taken from the testimony titled in English, Smoke over Birkenau, of Liana Milou, who was a Jewish Italian woman. So I quote, "With the overcast sky depriving us of our celestial clock, time stood still. 1 minute it would seem very early, and the next almost time to head back. We were trapped in a grey, motionless world, truly Dante's timeless air in the circles of hell." End of quote. In the testimonies, the survivors quite often refer to the works of Dante Alighieri to evoke the atmosphere of the camps, because in addition to the parallel established between the hellish experience of the camps and Dante's hell, the evocative power of the Italian poet is very likely to stir the reader's imagination. However, imagination has its limits, and the impression made by reality is always more powerful than that made by a mere story, as states Dostoevsky in his account of the Siberian prison titled The House of the Dead. In point of fact, Jewish Italian author Giuliana Tedeschi, who survived Auschwitz, explains that imagination never had the power to counter reality. It is in that sense that she narrates her experience of the death marches. So I translate her. "A gloomy landscape that pursued and oppressed us with a constant impression of a trap, of an ambush, and of death. Impossible to populate it, as in Nordic fables full of fantasy, with witches, Sabbath, sprites, dwarves, and fairies. Any poetic and fantastic spirit was far away from us. Reality was the echo of the German Posten's gunshots that sent a shudder through our whole being. A shot. Someone hadn't had the strength anymore to hold on behind the column and had fallen on the side of the road." End of quotation. The death march, which happens in a landscape giving an impression of a trap, of an ambush, and of death, first occurs in Tedeschi's writing within the scope of a world steeped in imagination. Yet, if the survivor uses fabulous intertextuality to evoke the death marches, it serves above all to show the powerlessness of literature and imagination faced with a brutal return to reality. On the narrative level, the intertextuality is linked to the description, whereas the gunshot is linked to the return of the action. Let me remind you furthermore that in the description given by Denise Dufournier of her arrival in Ravensbrück, which had been compared to the lapidary evocation of Jean Samuel's arrival at Auschwitz in his letter to Primo Levi, she also refers to the effect the Nordic fables have on children to give the reader an idea of her terror upon seeing the Ravensbrück prisoners, of seeing the image of what she was soon to become. To describe their experiences, the two survivors find themselves confronted to the inadequacy of language and of account. And remember that Dufournier does mention this inadequacy of any account to describe her emotions upon arriving in Ravensbrück. To find a solution for this inadequacy, they attempt to recall another experience to the reader, that of the terror caused by the telling of fantastic tales during childhood. This serves to illustrate the feelings of panic and helplessness experienced by the prisoners. The comparison to childhood terrors in Dufournier and Tedeschi is an integral part of their femininity and allows them to effectively communicate their emotions to the reader. Hence, Dufournier and Tedeschi both use an intertextual reference to Nordic fables to evoke a fantastic imaginary universe. However, if it is true that the reference is the same, the way it is exploited diverges considerably from one survivor to the other. In Dufournier, the fantastic intertext is what comes closer to the strange and incredible reality that she discovers upon entering Ravensbrück. Unlike Dufournier, Tedeschi presents the same intertext as the opposite of the reality of the death marches, because she suggests that the childhood terror caused by Nordic fables seems harmless harmless because of the imaginary nature of their characters. It doesn't come close to the level of terror felt in the face of the brutality and imminent reality of death. But nevertheless, even though literature and imagination reveal themselves to be powerless in the face of death, they assume in Tedeschi another function, which is to remind any person of his or her belonging to the human race, a vital function in the camps. So I will quote for a last time Juliana Tedeschi. So those are the prisoners talking to her. They say, tell us a story, you who know how to tell. It had become a habit that upon returning from work in the evening, I would tell the story of a novella, a book, or film. And the story would carry us far away to a world where there existed books aligned on well-known shelves, pens and pencils on the table, music, the radio, and the gramophone. A world where we were men and women and not simply mensch. Girls, I will tell you the story of a novella, but this time not from the powerful Kuprin, from the unforgettable Chekhov, from the adorable Guy de Maupassant. I will tell you the story of my novella, a real novella. End of quotation. For Juliana Tedeschi, and certainly for many other authors of testimonies, the act of telling stories has the power to tie the narrator and listener to the human race. It is the power that literature and the arts give to the prisoners at the time of internment, and in the afterwar, the real experiences, the testimonies, will wield the same power to restore to the survivors their place in the world of the living. So to conclude, I would like to state once again that the testimonies published in the post-war years by women and Jewish survivors are the result of an internal pressure and of a will to communicate their experiences. In a context of interlocutors without an understanding of the events, faced with a refusal to hear, the authors of testimonies resort to imagination to construct a model reader to orient expectations. Imagination takes on two functions for them: that of enabling the survivors to write for an imaginary reader, and that of allowing the potential reader to get to a certain understanding. Intertextuality proves to be a particularly efficient narrative technique to facilitate the comprehension of the reader by stimulating his or her imagination. The preponderance of intertextuality in the testimonies also points toward the importance of literature to the survivors themselves. Upon their return from the camps, the survivors find they no longer belong in one world nor the other. They don't feel they are entirely part of their society, of the human community to which they have returned. Though they are no longer physically in the camp, their thoughts are still imprisoned, and to be set free, if such a thing is possible, they call on the imaginary, immaterial universe of literature, a world in which they don't live either, but that can, in a certain way, ward off the world of the camp, or at least structure, control their way of evoking it in their will to transmit their experiences. To the refusal to hear, that is the reaction of a majority of their interlocutors, women and Jewish survivors oppose the power of imagination and, thanks to it, embark on writing testimonies that are well and truly part of reality.